Should we go ahead and start? Yeah. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Viva Cristo Rey. Que viva. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Thank you all for coming. I do foresee that there will be one more session, final installment. So hopefully that will be at the 4 sessions. And I am recording these, as you can see. And by the way, because I'm recording and because I do want to put these on the internet, I do want to mention, just for the purpose of that my name is Father John Rickard. I'm the pastor at Immaculate Conception in Omaha, Nebraska. I'm a member of the priestly fraternity of St. Peter. I mention that because at least I personally don't really like this idea of just anonymous preaching. I have serious problems with that. So anyway, I just want to, if people need to get a hold of me, they can find out where to get a hold of me. So as I say, at least I'll have that information there. And also, again, if you're just tuning in after these, this is the 3rd of 4 sessions. Most of what I'm saying is drawn from Father Jose Maria Iraburu, Spanish priest, his work, the Acts of the Apostles in North America. Terrific work, by the way. Any questions before we begin for tonight? Any questions? And I don't want to scandalize any of you, by the way, but just by way of a foretaste, I have to admit that this is one of those nights where you just want to get a bottle of tequila and say that nobody gets out of here until it's all gone, because there's just a lot of bad news. There's a lot of bad news. It's a very, very sad story. Now, how many of you have seen For Greater Glory? Many of you, right? Pretty good movie all in all, but we're going to find that in the end, the movie is a little bit, looks at things through rose-colored glasses, whereas the reality is much, much more grim, just by way of forewarning. Now, when we left off last time, we had the story of this maid who heard the bell ringing to go and rise to the call to defend, and so she just left everything, including the pots on the fire. She left everything to go help out, right? And so continuing then in that thread there, Father Iraburu says this: one cannot adequately appreciate the value of the Catholic Mexican women in the Cristiada, who spread propaganda, conveyed directions, received fugitives, cured wounds, and helped clandestinely with the provision of food and arms. The women's brigades of St. Joan of Arc, this is his term, the pretty brigades, the Brigadas Bonitas, wrote legendary stories. But in the end, war is a matter for men, and it came to fierce peasants. Ezekiel Mendoza Barragan, a rancher from Coacaman in Michoacan. Michoacan is kind of between Jalisco and Mexico City. Also very solid, very Catholic, very conservative, whose patriarchal voice we will hear on other occasions relates this. Quote, this is from Ezekiel Mendoza Barragan. Hundreds of us signed the papers, sent them to Calles and his followers, but everything was futile. The Callistas thought themselves to be really something and proceeded to press us, killing people and confiscating the private possessions of Catholics. I myself, unknowingly but with gusto, on finding out the new proceedings of such a government, exalted myself and wanted to cover the sun with a finger. Such were my sentiments. I went to muster people armed and ready for war in defense of the liberty of God and of neighbors. Jean Meyer, in volume 1 of his work, describes in detail the ups and downs which came along with the passage of the years of the Cristiada, which he divides into the following phases. Incubation from July to December of 1926. Explosion of armed uprising from January of 1927. Consolidation of positions from July of 1927 to July of 1928. And that is to say, from the time of General Gorostieta, that he took leadership of the Cristiados until the death of Obregon. Prolongation of the conflict from August 1928 until February 1929, a time in which the government began to realize that it could not defeat the Cristiados militarily. The apogee of the Cristiado movement from March to June of 1929, and by apogee we mean their greatest level of success, right? And tragically, the disbandment of the Cristiados in June 1929, when the ill-named arrangements between the church and state were produced. If I slip and call those arreglos, I'm sorry, I try to use arrangements throughout, but if you hear me say arreglos, arrangements, that's the same thing, okay? So hopefully I did a consistent translation there, but that's what I'm talking about. So Father Iraburu has a section on the Federal Army. The Army, consubstantial with the government in Mexico of that time, quote, considered the church to be its personal adversary, an active agent of anti-clericalism and of anti-religious antagonism. It carried on its own war, its own religious war. General Eligio Ortiz ordered a soldier shot because he saw him wearing a scapular. Some officials led their troops into combat with the cry, "Viva Satan," long live Satan. Quote, each weapon recruited on its own. The enlistment was supposed to be voluntary and committed for at least 3 years, a condition that many times was not fulfilled, to the point that they started using means to keep the volunteers tied. They used whatever they could find: common criminals, unemployed workers, peasants, and above all, the rural lower classes and Indians, whether conquered or not, subjected or not. The brutality and lack of discipline of these troops can hardly be described. Not having the services of a quartermaster, quote, the provision of food was under the charge of the women accompanying the soldiers, the famous soldaderas, who marched along the side of the army and, like locusts, descended on fields and towns. Desertion, which was frequent even in times of peace, came to be massive during the time of war. General Amaro, head of the Federal Army, did not succeed in lining up more than 70,000 men, even though he spent the whole time recruiting 20,000 deserters a year from 70,000 soldiers. This famous General Amaro, an Indian, son of a peon from Zacatecas, was a man who was intelligent, implacable, and bloodthirsty, who ordered his Air Force to bomb, located on the hill of Cubilete, the monument to Christ the King. In the end, came to be very civil and reconciled with the church a number of years before his death. The federal forces were poor horsemen and poor soldiers who shot from far off, used too much ammunition, easily lost arms, and did not know the terrain of the areas they went to. This explains, and I will say partially explains, why the Cristiados, whose characteristics for fighting were the opposite, inflicted so many losses on them. The Caístas, indeed, were very cruel, but, quote, the severity of the repression, the execution of all prisoners, the killing of civilians, the sacking, violation, and burning of towns and fields left in the wake of federal forces the seed for so many other uprisings. So again, the brutality of the federal forces was such that when you have the people against them, their back is completely up against the wall. So they're going to fight with all they've got. The war was carried out also in the press from the government, hiding the magnitude of the conflict or always giving the impression of imminent victory. Joined with the military fight already mentioned above, General Amaro propagandized a campaign of defanaticization, like the one that gave the orders to the governor of Jalisco to change the names of all the places that bore names of saints. And this is a change that remains even to the present day. I'm adding my own comment here. So if you look at all the streets in the area around our church in Guadalajara, all of these carry names of secular revolutionaries. The names of the saints have been completely obliterated. Yeah, question?
Father, I was wondering with a lot of people, like Castro, I think you had Che Guevara, and then
Che Guevara.
Okay, okay, you know how to say his name. And then Hitler. There's always an individual that these leaders usually have that has a particular bloodlust. Now, did Caius have a particular person he had in charge that had that role of the bloodlust where they killed the majority of people?
Yeah, I would say on the one hand, I'm not really sure, but on the other hand, I think it's probably evident from what I've said already, is that this General Amaro was very bloodthirsty, and Caius himself was extremely bloodthirsty. There's no question about it. And this was encouraged by to be so the case with others as well. So again, I don't see Caius as being a mere theoretician who theoretically wanted, but he had an absolute hatred of the church and wanted to see people's blood, people killed and people's blood shed over this. So yeah, I mean, in terms of having the thug, the hammer, as a right-hand man, in this case, I don't think it was really even needed. General Amaro may have been that man, but Caius was a general. Remember that. Yeah. Almost all the presidents of Mexico, as we saw from Porfirio Diaz all the way on, have been generals, almost all of them. And so they are no strangers to conflict and bloodshed, right? So, okay. I mean, I don't know. That's about the best answer I can give to your question.
That's okay.
And so, yeah, you do see these names of the streets that are very, very secular with very little or no mention of saints, which is very sad. And also what you do see as well is you see, not very far from our church, a beautiful, beautiful convent that was appropriated by the government and secularized and everything. But you walk in there and you know it's a convent. You can tell by the architecture. So it's very sad that the remnants of all this secularization remain, definitely.
And the church couldn't reclaim it?
The church never did reclaim them. So, and we'll kind of see why that is. All means were tried, including bribery. And so on one occasion, the government tried to buy off a Cristero officer called El 14, the 14, right? So if you've seen the movie, which most of you have, you remember 14, he's a very rough around edges, kind of thug-like character. His real name was Victoriano Ramirez. He's the guy who kills all those guys single-handedly. That's how he got his name, by the way, because he killed 14 of them, right? 14. But he replied, "Don't give me anything except to get things worked out with the priests and the churches, and I'll be at peace. But as long as they don't work it out, they shouldn't think that they're going to buy me with money." And so that's what we have that from his own, we have that directly. And so again, if you remember in the movie, there's that scene where he's about to string this guy up, and the guy says, "Oh, I have money," and he says to him, "Spend it in hell." You remember that? But that's true to character. Now, whether that actually happened in real life, I don't know. But again, that is true to character. He was not one to be bought off. Okay? The desperation of the government kept increasing as the months passed, and the government saw itself unable to conquer, in the words of the governor of Colima, which is a state in Mexico, quote, "the episcopal hordes of fanatics who, fooled by clerical bull, have thrown themselves into the very crazy adventure of restoring the predominance of the priests." And I have to interject a comment. Does it sound anything like the modern day left? In the middle of 1928, the Cristeros, approximately 25,000 men in arms, quote, "now could not be conquered," says Meyer, which constituted a great victory. But the government, sustained by American force, did not seem to be at the point of losing. In reality, the position of the Cristeros in the middle of 1929 was better than that of the federal forces. For combating for an absolute cause, they had greater morale and discipline, and operating in small groups which hit and run, PKUye, hit and run, PKUye, suffered many fewer losses than the soldiers of Caius. So it was a guerrilla war for the most part, right? After 3 years of war, it is calculated that 25 to 30,000 Cristeros died and about 60,000 federal forces. So that's more than twice the number on the side of the Federals as opposed to the Cristiados. Question?
Yeah, and I read that the Cristiados got most of their weapons from the Federal Army.
They did indeed, and I did mention that before, is that they didn't have a source of weapons. Where they got their weapons mostly from was from the federal forces themselves. So many of them just cut and run, by the way, right? Again, desertions were very common, and they would just flee. And let's face it too, even among the federal forces, it'd be interesting to hear, get some testimony from that side of things. But let's face it, even among those federal forces, they must have had a lot of quasi-Catholics who just did not feel right with what they were doing, right? Who just like, this is just wrong. They must have had that sense. And I will digress even further. Do you know about the San Patricios? Have you ever heard about that?
Yeah.
In the War of 1848, the U.S.-Mexican War, there was an Irish brigade of soldiers. They were Irish Catholics, and we were fighting Mexico, and they clued in pretty quickly that this was a religious war and that it was against the Catholic Church. So they switched sides and became the San Patricios. Now things turned out very badly for them. But they clued in, and it's like, hey, we can't do this. We're fighting against the church here. So they switched sides. But the San Patricios, that was in the war, Mexican-American War of 1848. So again, I can only imagine that even though we're dealing with kind of not the highest stratum of Mexican society, probably very poorly catechized, very minimal in the practice of religion, they must have had some gut sense like, yeah, this is just not right what we're doing. And so that probably worked in the favor of the Cristiados as well. That's only my guess. It'd be interesting to follow up on that question if possible. So I do want to take you back. As I say, we have 25 to 30,000 Cristiados, 60,000 federal soldiers, so round it up a little bit, 100,000 people. And that is what the Encyclopedia Britannica calls difficulties. In January of 1929, the American ambassador Morrow, he's also in the movie. Dwight Morrow, kind of bearded or mustachioed guy. He seems very humane, and he doesn't like this, and he's trying to be a peacemaker and stuff. Do you remember him? Kind of a distortion, as we'll see. Well, actually, very much a distortion, as we'll see.
Isn't that Charles Lindbergh's father-in-law?
Charles Lindbergh's father-in-law. That's right. Who insisted to the government and to the press not to use the term Cristiados but instead the term bandits. He thought it unlikely to obtain peace in Mexico, quote, before the religious question was settled. And so, again, the movie tends to portray him rather favorably, but Father Irauru, rooted deeply in the facts, has a very different picture, as we will see. I'm just heads up there. Continuing, in February, the same politician saw the picture as being very dark, and a senator said in a discourse to his colleagues, quote, "Is it that our soldiers don't know how to combat ranchers, or that they don't want this rebellion to be over? Let's just say it and not beat around the bush. Do not forget that if 3 more states of Mexico rise up, you'd better watch out for your hold on power." So there was alarm. There was realization. In fact, one really good video I've seen on YouTube mentions that towards the end of things, even some of the generals under Calles were like, "This is crazy. It is crazy to keep going this way. We have to put an end to this." So the government was really on the run. The Cristiados were winning. It's very important to remember that. In the middle of 1929, it was seen very clearly that, at least in the short time, neither side could win. Now, that doesn't contradict what I just said. We had reached something of a stalemate, but as we say in modern day political terms, the momentum was clearly on the side of the Cristiados. Does that make sense? Nevertheless, in this dead heat, there was a great difference. While the Cristiados were disposed to keep fighting as long as necessary to obtain the abolition of the laws that persecuted the church, the government, seeing itself bankrupt both financially and socially in the eyes of nations, had extreme urgency to end the conflict as soon as possible. So they're ready just to throw in the towel, even though, again, in terms of the actual standing, it may look about even. The reality is it was not far from that tipping point where the Cristiados could really have just gone all the way and taken everything. These were favorable conditions to negotiate the recognition of the rights of the church. And so what comes up next then is the rumors of a possible agreement. From the middle of 1927, the supreme command of the Cristeros was under General Gorostieta, a career military man to whom the rumors kept coming of a possible arrangement between the church and the state, supported by the Cristero Guardia Nacional, National Guard. Now let me tell you a little bit about Ernesto Gorostieta. He was indeed a very, very highly qualified military man. He went to the equivalent of West Point in Mexico. I mean, there, West Point. And he was a general. In fact, when he was killed, he was under 40 years old. So he was really very, very accomplished. But there's a very surprising fact about him. He was a Mason. However, when one of his children was born, his wife, who actually was a devout Catholic and to whom he was very, very much devoted, his wife wanted to get the child baptized. Okay, so they go down to church and they find the church closed and locked and everything, inaccessible. And his wife, of course, was extremely upset by this, and that hurt him very deeply because he had such a devotion to his wife. And so, again, something inside him flipped there, and even in spite of his own lack of faith and secularism and everything else, he really detested Calles. He really hated him. And so it was actually pretty easy to recruit on the side of the Cristeros. And let's face it, too, to be really honest, very fascinating figure. He's very mixed, a very mixed figure.
Was that Andy Garcia's?
Andy Garcia in the movie. Yes, exactly. He was also personally very ambitious. I mean, he was. He was a very accomplished go-getter, had been to a very prestigious academy. So he was ambitious personally as well, and that certainly played into it, okay? That's all right. God uses these means, which are mysterious to us. Oh, and by the way, just so I don't forget to mention it later, to the very best of my knowledge, as the movie itself sort of alludes to, I think he died reconciled with the church. To the very, very best of my knowledge, I think that in the end, the example of the Cristeros around him, he got enough of his faith back that he went to confession and died reconciled with the church. To the best of my knowledge, that's the case. So anyway, he's in charge of the Cristero forces. As these rumors increased, the 16th of May, 1929, Gorostieta wrote the Mexican bishops a long letter of which we quote a fragment. And I did find on the internet a very good source that I believe has the whole letter. It's just all in Spanish, but I think it does have the whole thing if you want to see it. So this is an extract that Father Iraburu quotes from the letter of General Gorostieta. From the time our conflict began, the national press and even the foreign press have not ceased to speak of possible arrangements between the so-called government and some member selected by the Mexican episcopate to bring an end to the religious problem. Every time that such news has appeared, the men in the combat have felt that the chill of death is invading them, 1,000 times worse than all the dangers they have decided to face. Every time that the press tells us that a designated bishop is in negotiation with Callism, we feel a full strike in the face, so much more painful as it comes from those from whom we should hope for consolation, a word of support in our battle, support and consolation that, with one extremely honorable exception, we have not received from anyone. And that exception is Bishop Martinez Izarete, the Bishop of Huejutla, who had been exiled 17 years. Continuing with the letter of Gorostieta. If the bishops, upon presenting themselves to deal with the government, approve of the approach of the Guardia Nacional, which is what he's in charge of there, if they are in agreement with the only thing that the despot left us, they will need to consider our way of thinking and attend to our needs. And in that case, we have no objections. So in other words, if they're really willing to take what the Cristeros stand for seriously, then we can deal with that. If they truly, truly will give us a hearing and take our concerns and our views seriously, we have no objections in that case. Continuing, if the bishops, upon presenting themselves to deal with the government, disapprove of our approach if they do not take the Guardia Nacional into account and try to give a solution to the conflict independently of the one we strive for. If they forget our dead, if they do not take into consideration our thousands of widows and orphans, then we reject such an approach as unworthy and traitorous. There are many reasons, and many different kinds of reasons, why we believe the Guardia Nacional and not the episcopate should be the ones to resolve the situation. The problem is not purely religious. It is a question of liberty in general, and the Guardia Nacional has been constituted, in fact, as the defender of all the liberties and as the genuine representative of the people. For the support that the people impart to us is what brought us into existence. And so this would be the $64,000 question. Is this only a religious question and therefore properly left just to the bishops or their representatives? Or in fact, is it broader than that? Is it a question of civil rights, of political rights? That is what Gorostiete is arguing. And because of that, he thinks that the Guardia Nacional is better, in a much better position to represent those exigencies than the bishops in the simple question of religion itself. As a final reason that the Guardia Nacional should be in charge of resolving the conflict, we believe that we have the right to be heard, if for no other reason than that of being a constitutive part of the Catholic Church in Mexico, precisely for being the most important part of the institution that the Mexican bishops govern. And so that's the end of the citation. So again, I think his argument is worth consideration here. It's like, look, we are Catholics too. And if the Catholic hierarchy just does this completely independently of us, they're basically leaving us as Catholics out of the picture. Does his argument make sense? Whether or not you agree, do you see what he's saying? It'd be interesting to read the whole letter. I think perhaps that could really, I mean, I'm favorably disposed to what he's saying there. It certainly, in my mind, it makes the case that there should have been dual cooperation there and not just a one-sided thing, right? That there should have been a joint agreement that both sides would have to say, okay, okay, and not just one or the other. That would be my view. And I did find a place where the whole letter is available, as I say. I haven't had time to read it through. So that was May 16th of 1929. June 2nd, which is what, just a few weeks later, 1929, General Gorostiete was assassinated in an ambush by the Callistas. I think involved the treachery of one of his colonels, I believe. And then General Degollado succeeded him as being in charge of the Guardia Nacional. And as I say, I think it is the case that he died reconciled to the church. And so then we reach the really, really bad news. The arrangements of June 21st, 1929. The history of the arrangements, arreglos, attained in June of 1929 is so sad that we will make only a brief reference to it, focusing above all on the documented information that Lopez Beltran has recently given us on the matter. Monsignor Ruiz y Flores, the apostolic delegate ad referendum, chose as a secretary to negotiate Monsignor Pascual Diaz y Barreto, we've heard that name before, quote, the only bishop who had shown a decided effort to obtain a deal with the Callistas. Both were transported from the U.S. to Mexico in solitary confinement in a train car by the American diplomat Dwight Whitney Morrow. He's the one I just mentioned. A banker and diplomat, a Protestant and a Mason, an accomplice of Caius and of the president at this time, Portes Gil. So at this point, by the way, Caius has been driven out of power because he was such a disaster. As Robert told us, Mexico was financially bankrupt. And so Caius was forced out of power, and he actually died in obscurity and disgrace. Whether he reconciled with the church, I don't know. I'm afraid he didn't. I don't know. But he did die in obscurity and disgrace. Actually, he's buried not very far from where Blessed Miguel Pro is buried, ironically. Even after arriving in Mexico City, the bishops continued to be in solitary confinement in the luxurious residence of the banker Agustin Legorreta. They did not receive the Mexican bishops nor a representative of the League for the Defense of Religious Liberty. They did not even wish to receive a Bishop Miguel de la Mora, who is the secretary of the Bishop Subcommittee, who had sent notice to Bishop Flores saying, quote, he had great and urgent things to communicate to him and that he should not make any agreement before hearing it. But they wouldn't listen to him, wouldn't even receive him. The doors of that house in those days were open only for, quote, Morrow and for the foreign priests Wilfred Parsons and Edmund Walsh, S.J., who was an expert in international politics at Georgetown University, and for Cruchaga Tocornal, the ambassador from Chile, and for other foreigners, but not for Mexicans. It can be affirmed then that the bishops of the arreglos, the arrangements with Portes Gil, the president, did not fulfill the written norms that Pius XI had given them, for they had not taken into account the judgment of the local bishops, nor the Cristeros, nor the National League. They did not even remotely accomplish the derogation of the persecutorial laws against the church. And still less did they obtain written guarantees to protect the fate of the Cristeros after they put down their arms. All they managed to get from the president were some words of conciliation and goodwill, and some written declarations in which, without repealing any law, the intention was affirmed to, quote, apply them without sectarian bias or prejudice. And so, with things being what they were, the two bishops, convinced by the American ambassador Morrow that it was not possible to obtain from the president anything more than declarations like these, and counseled by Cruchaga and Father Walsh, who, quote, thought them sufficient, they accepted the following document composed personally in English by Morrow. Note that this is Archbishop Leopoldo Ruiz of Morelia, even though the text is by Morrow. Quote, Bishop Diaz and I have had various meetings with the President of the Republic of Mexico. I am pleased to announce that all the conversations have been marked by a spirit of mutual goodwill and respect. As a consequence of the aforementioned declarations made by the President, the Mexican clergy will resume religious services in accordance with existing laws. For my part, I hold out the hope that the resumption of religious services, and here Irabaru himself breaks in and says, this is a Protestant expression from Morrow, who's the author of the document, can lead the Mexican people, animated by a spirit of goodwill, to cooperate in all the moral efforts that are done for the benefit of all those of the land of all our elders. June 21st, 1929. So again, that's Leopoldo Ruiz, Archbishop of Morelia, and Apostolic Delegate. So I don't know if you noticed a phrase in there that's very key, in accordance with existing laws. The existing laws, of course, were the very ones that unleashed the Cristiada. 20 or 30,000 Cristeros died in order to repeal those laws. In vain? Did they fight futilely with such great losses and sufferings, these Cristeros and their families? In 1929, the Jesuit Eduardo Iglesias, under the pseudonym Aquiles P. Moctezuma, in an article entitled The Religious Conflict of 1926, wrote with some satisfaction, quote, the meetings between the church and the state have ended well. That interpretation is not the most common one today. But there are even now those who consider that the arrangements, quote, were the least evil ones possible under the circumstances. Such is the opinion of Juan Landareche Obregon, who furthermore insists that the arrangements, quote, in no way mean that the effort, sacrifice, and the blood of the Cristeros were useless towards the liberty of the Catholic Church and respect for religion and the faithful. On the contrary, the Cristeros demonstrated to the government by their sacrifices, efforts, and lives that in Mexico one could not attack the Catholic religion nor the Church with impunity. And all this was shown in a form so convincing to the tyrants that it obliged them not only to stop from religious persecution, but also to respect religion and the practice and development of it, in spite of all the dispositions of the Constitution of 1917 that were opposed to it, and that were not carried out because they could not be carried out because the people rejected them. The fruits of the Cristiada have been received and continue to be received 60 years after the battle, and certainly will culminate in due time in the full realization of that which those who gave their testimony fought for. And that's the end of the quote. To which I, and probably Father Irabaru, although he doesn't say it here, would say, mentira. Mentira, mentira. That's total bull. That is a total crock of lies. In 1993, the government of Mexico conceded to the Church a precarious legal recognition as a religious association and reestablished diplomatic relations with the Holy See in 1993. And the chapter here then, or the title next, is A Triumph of Freemasonry. Some days after the arrangements obtained above all by the Masons Morrow and Portes Gil, the president, on the 27th of June 1929, the Masons gave a grand banquet in honor of Portes Gil, who after the dinner spoke to his reverend brethren. Quote, while the clergy were rebellious against the institution laws, the government of the Republic had a duty to combat them. Now, dear brothers, the clergy have fully recognized the state, and they have declared so without dissimulation, that they will submit themselves strictly to the laws. Applause. And I could not deny to Catholics the right that they have to submit to the laws. The battle, nevertheless, is eternal. The battle began 20 centuries ago. I declare in the presence of Freemasons here that while I am in the government, I will carry out this legislation strictly. Applause. In Mexico, the state and Freemasonry have been, in recent years, one and the same thing. Two entities that go forward together because the men who in recent years have been in power have known how to form common cause with the revolutionary principles of Freemasonry. Close, end of quote. He alludes to the same revolution that assassinated Garcia Moreno in Ecuador and that won so many victories in the 19th and 20th centuries in Latin America with the support of local and American Freemasonry. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to look into this, but I believe that basically like Bernardo O'Higgins and all the liberators of South America, the Freemasons, those were all Freemasonic rebellions against Spain. Of course, the last place that Spain lost was Cuba in 1898. I don't know if you know that. But the independence of all those Latin American states was due to revolutionary work by Freemasons. Portes Gil, later in his book called the Battle Between the Civil Power and the Clergy, made quite clear, quote, the apparent capitulation of the bishops, to which the name of arrangement was given with the government, was nothing other than to submit themselves unconditionally to the law. In 1958, away from the church, he died in Mixcoac, and in the obituary published by the very respectable Grand Lodge Valle de Mexico, they cited him, quote, as an active member and Grand Captain of the Guard of the Supreme Council, 33rd degree. Now, how about a little digression? We're doing pretty well on time here. So the language we hear from these Freemasons is, well, the church needs to follow the law, so the law can be the supreme law of the land. We get that story here in America as well, right? So how do we handle that? How do we handle the HHS mandate when it comes from the Obama administration? I think they did away with it recently, right? Didn't they? I think they basically abrogated it. Thanks be to God. So it's very simple. God is truth. He is the way, the truth, and the life. It's pure truth. Truth cannot contradict itself, right? So if God says, always, always, always obey the civil laws, but the civil law says, disobey God's law, then God would be telling us to violate his own law. He would be contradicting himself, right? God's pure truth, he won't contradict himself. So to avoid the contradiction, we have to put it this way. God, speaking to us through the fourth commandment, says to obey legitimate human authorities, provided that they do not command us to go against his own law, right? So if legitimate human authority, whether it's a state government or whether it's a teacher in a classroom, right? It has very broad application. If the human authority gives a command that they have the authority to make, and that the command does not contradict higher law, then that law is to be observed. So then it's all consistent. Does that make sense? And of course, divine law is the highest of all. Natural law is higher than any human law. No human on this earth, even the Pope, can change natural law because he cannot change human nature. Right? So any law, any agreement, any action, whatever that goes against the natural law is wrong. Human beings cannot change the natural law. We can't change the divine law. So again, God is commanding us to obey those laws that are consistent with his law. And as long as we do that, we're being good according to the Fourth Amendment. But to say that the church should be subject to the state is insanity. It goes against what God himself wants. Does that make sense? Okay. So then we reach the disbandment of the Cristeros. The supreme officer of the Guardia Nacional, who at this point, because Gorostiete was killed, is General Jesus Degollado Guizar, dutifully ordered all the Cristeros, quote, in spite of the fact that it tears our soul out of us, a heartbreaking message of disbandment, of which we quote the final paragraph. Quote, the National Guard disappears, not conquered by our enemies, but in reality abandoned by those who should receive, first of all, the valiant fruit of their sacrifices and abnegation. Ave Cristo. We who go to our humiliation for thee, to banishment, perhaps to a glorious death, victims of our enemies, with the most fervent love we have, salute thee, and one more time proclaim thee, King of our country. Viva Cristo Rey, viva Santa Maria de Guadalupe, Dios, Patria y Libertad. Perhaps to a glorious death. In fact, soon after the arrangements, the government showing, quote, the spirit of goodwill and respect assured to the negotiating bishops, began, through sinister agents, the systematic assassination and premeditated murder of the Cristeros who had laid down their arms. The manhunt was serious and effective, since one can estimate, based on the evidence, a number of about 1,500 victims, of whom 500 were officers from the rank of lieutenant to general. And so, yes, you heard that correctly. After the Cristeros laid down their arms, the government came after them and managed to kill about 1,500 of them. It is also necessary to say, and this to the credit of the following men, that more than one federal general warned the Cristeros of the danger that they were facing. But in any case, even with this, more Cristero officers were killed after the arrangements than during the war. This presented a huge and very difficult test of faith for the Cristeros, who nevertheless remained faithful to the church with the help, above all, of the same priests who had helped them during the war. The chaplain of the Cristeros of Colima, which is a state in Mexico, Father Enrique de Jesus Ochoa, in his book, The Cristeros of the Volcano of Colima, relates how, quote, Bishop Ruiz y Flores himself truly cried when he saw himself made a fool, when he saw the failure of the arrangements, if they can even be called that, as he himself said, writing in his own hand on August 1st, 1929. And remember, he was the Bishop of Morelia, who initially was very sympathetic to the Cristeros, but eventually ended up being on the side of Morrow and Hill. He adds, and this is the chaplain, I myself saw Pius XI cry when he thought about the arrangements in Mexico. The truth is that the two bishops of the arrangements, and especially Bishop Pascual Diaz, suffered much in the years afterwards, and at least on the part of certain sectors, suffered a real moral lynching because people were so upset with them. Recently, the journal 30 Days, 1993, number 66, published an interview with the Mexican painter Dolores Ortega, then aged 85, who lived around the time of the Cristiada with her husband, Carlos Diaz de Soriano, one of those with authority in the National League. To the question, why did the bishops sign the accords, the arreglos? She responds, they were confused and deceived. After the arrangements, we invited Bishop Diaz, the Archbishop of Mexico City, to dine with us. We were eating, and my husband said to him, tell me, Eminence, what do you think of the arrangements? He lowered his eyes, tears poured out, and he said, Dear Charles, please don't bring this up to me. It causes too much grief. They deceived us. To that, Mr. Ortega responded to him, no, they didn't. We knew it was a trick, that the government would not respect the arrangements. We all knew that, the League and the Cristeros. You knew that it was a trick, that laying down arms and coming out of hiding was certain death. And why did they do it? Because the church ordered it, from fidelity, from obedience to the church. And so it was. Even today, there are a few Catholic peoples who love their priests and bishops as much as the Mexican people do. And at this point, Father Irabaru continues, let us make a chronicle of the martyrs, which is the most important thing of all that occurred in regard to the Cristiada. And so that's where we will pick up next time. However, I'll just make a comment here. So this whole situation with this snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, of course, was very scandalous. And there is in Mexico today actually a very large SEDEVACANTISM movement. Maybe as many as 1 million people, maybe. In many small towns, they never accepted any of the changes from Vatican II. They've kept the old Mass, but they've become SEDEVACANTISTs. And I believe it is the case, now I could be mistaken, but I believe it is the case that they were so scandalized by all this that they became very, very, very suspicious of the hierarchy of Rome. And so it paved the way. Now, whether it's a direct continuity or not, I don't know, but it certainly caused such scandal among them. And also, too, one thing that Father Irabaru doesn't mention here, and I'm not sure if he does in the course of this article, is there was another flare-up 10 years later. In the late 30s, there was another flare-up. Now, it was not as severe and not as prolonged, but again, there was another flare-up of the very same things. And again, of a Cristero-type uprising against it. I think that was the last one. I think that the last time there have been truly armed uprisings, what occurred before 1940. But we also see, even though it's not Mexico, it's Spain, we see this absolutely horrific beyond words persecution of the church in Spain, 1936 to 1939. Just horrific beyond words. And it's done by the same people. It's done by the same people. The leopard does not change the spots on those. Well, okay. Pretty good there. I think we're at a pretty good starting point. One thing I'll mention here, maybe be more fitting at the very, very end, but since we have a few minutes here and I happen to have this in front of me, I do want to mention a few resources that you have available. One is this book. This is the 1-volume version. He also has a 3-volume version by Jean Meyer. Father Robert has been quoting him a lot, but this is called the Cristiada. This copy is in Spanish, but they have it in English. There is an English translation. You can get it from Amazon. I don't think it's all that expensive, you know, maybe $40 or something, but it's not frightfully expensive. It's not cheap, but it has amazing pictures. And so maybe I could just leave it here and maybe you can kind of flip through it or something like that, but there are just fantastic pictures in there. So it is mainly a book of pictures, and the pictures do tell you a lot. On YouTube, there is a very excellent video of about under 15 minutes, 14 minutes, I think, something like that, called The Real Cristeros Interviewed. It's really worth watching. Very, very well done. Very Catholic, very pro-Cristero. It's in Spanish, but it has subtitles. There is some bad language in Spanish. So if you know Spanish curse words, you're going to get a few. They don't have very nice things to say about Caius. But it is really worth watching that video. There's also a movie that came out some years ago, maybe, let's see, I think it was in Lexington at the time, so maybe 7 or 8 years ago, called Padre Pro, on Blessed Miguel Agustin Pro. It's okay. I mean, its heart is in the right place. I think I would have done it differently. It's okay. I mean, the filming is really beautiful. The photography of the movie is really, I think, very well done. The best thing done about it. The acting and script, I'm a little bit more iffy on. But, you know, it's worth watching once, maybe. I just wish they had done more with the whole thing about Padre Pro. As you may know, he was the one who used all these amazing disguises and tricks, and he was very, very sneaky. I mean, there's amazing, amazing stories I could tell you about him. And I gave a sermon about him one time, so I have that to hand if you want to see it. But it's nicely done. As I say, the heart's in the right place. Just kind of a disappointment, but maybe worth watching one time. And then the final reference I'll mention is that bulletin, which is actually like 50 pages long or something. It's in Spanish only, not translated. But it's from a parish in the Highlands, Los Altos, of the state of Jalisco. Fantastic. I really do want to read it someday. It looks absolutely fantastic. So if you want that, I know some of you in here have at least some Spanish, have at least a reading knowledge of Spanish for sure. So if you want that, let me know. I can get that to you. So there are some good resources out there. Be a little bit careful because you'll run into two types of sources you want to be a little bit iffy on. One is, again, is the very pro-Masonic side that wants to downplay all this, or simply portray these people as being unhinged fanatics or whatever it is, and they really completely downplay it. Or secondly, very closely related to those are just outright anti-Catholics who maybe don't necessarily deny things, but just have such a hatred of the church that they want to twist and spin it and say, well, they basically got what they deserved and stuff like that. So as always, be kind of careful out there on the internet if you just do broad searches, because you might find some sources that are really very evil. I'm just saying. I mean, the sort of evil that causes this to happen will be the sort of evil that defends it after it's happened, right? Let's not kid ourselves, okay? Any questions? I think that was it for tonight. And as I say, I think I should probably be able to finish up next week. Or is that a first Friday? Is that a first Friday? I think it is. So next Friday is first Friday, but then the Friday following, which would, whatever day that is, the 9th, I think, or 10th. Is it the 10th? Whatever it is, I'll conclude the series. Oh, which does finally raise one other question. If you have any other ideas or suggestions, topics, whatever, let me know. I would be open to ideas.
How about the Spanish War?
Oh boy, I don't really know much about it.
Oh.
All I can say is it's exceedingly gruesome. I mean, it's just gruesome beyond belief. I saw pictures of it one time and I've never, it's just horrible.
You and
It
Harris-
made the Nazis look like good people. I'm not kidding you. I'm serious. It was really, really, really horrific, some of the stuff they did in Spain in the 30s. Yeah.
I do have a question. but
Yeah.
Maybe I'll ask you maybe privately, because I don't want to like scandalize you.
Oh, okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
What's the state of the church in Mexico today?
I think the state of the church in Mexico today is actually about as good as it's been, as far as I know. Maybe about as good as it's ever gonna be, given the overwhelmingly Masonic tilt of the government. I do know, for example, that the current mayor of Guadalajara is probably a Mason. He is a secular. He's not a practicing Catholic, may have been baptized, but he's very much a secular, blah, 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 and it's really a shame that he was elected. But even he had a meeting with some church leaders about a topic, you know, and was willing to listen to them and talk, because Father Romanowski told me about it. You know, so there's a sort of maybe a pragmatism there. There may not be much love lost for the church, but there is a sort of a pragmatism there. I would say, though, one other aspect, though, that we've tended to forget is this whole other end run around the church is this very heavy promotion of Protestantism by America. Let's face it, by Protestants in America, Freemasons in America. They're pouring all this money into Latin America to prop up Protestantism. And so that's having horrible consequences. Yeah.
And the reason I ask that is, when I lived in California, it seemed like most of the Mexicans I knew were not Catholic. They
Yeah.
had other denominations.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Whether it's Assemblies of God
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's very, very tragic to see the attrition of Mexicans who come to America. That so many of them just go off and become Protestants or nothing or whatever. You know, they haven't held to their faith, which is really very sad, because when you look at a previous example of, well, two previous examples of hardship or persecution of the church. One was the reunification of Italy, which was carried out by Freemasons. The Italians who were Catholics were persecuted, and so many of them came over to America, but they stayed Catholic. They did for 2, 3, 4 generations, right? And the Irish, with the famine and the absolutely inhumane treatment of the Irish during the famine, they stayed Catholic. And the ones who came over to America did too, for several generations. But unfortunately, with the Mexicans this time, it's very, very tragic to see that within 1 or 2 generations, the faith is being lost. Very sad. Tragic. Yep. And so, yeah, we have a lot of work to do there. We have a lot of work to do. Any other questions or anything before we call it a night? All right, let me give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei Omnipotentis, Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti, descendat super vos, et maneat semper. Amen. Viva Cristo Rey. That was very bad. Try it again. Okay, viva!